My name is Maya. I am 28 years old now, but this story begins when I was just 20, living in a small town in Vietnam called Hoi An, where the streets are narrow and yellow and the river lights up with lanterns every full moon. It is a beautiful place. I did not understand how beautiful until I left it. I was married when I was 20. His name was Richard. He was 34, Canadian, and he had come to Vietnam for work, something with an export company. I didn't understand the details entirely. He met me through a mutual connection, a cousin of mine who knew his business partner. He came to our house several times for dinner. He was polite to my parents. He brought fruit and good tea. He spoke carefully, simply, so that I could follow along with my limited English. My mother liked him. My father said he seemed like a serious man, a reliable man. And I was young enough and naive enough to believe that reliable and kind were the same thing. We had a simple wedding, not big. My family didn't have much money, and Richard said he preferred something small. He smiled in the photos. I wore a white dress my aunt helped me sew. My mother cried. My younger sister, Lynn, held my hand until the very last moment and told me she would miss me every day. I told her I would call her all the time. I believed it when I said it. After the wedding, we had 3 weeks before the flight to Canada. Richard stayed with us in our house during those weeks. He was quiet most of the time, spending hours on his laptop or his phone, sometimes stepping outside to take calls in the street. I told myself he was busy, that it was work, that once we were in Canada and settled, he would have more time, more patience, more of himself to give. I was good at telling myself things like that. I had been doing it since the first week I met him, every time something felt slightly wrong, and I looked away from it quickly, the way you look away from a light that's too bright. The morning we left for the airport, I woke up before sunrise. I sat in my room for a long time, not packing, just sitting. I looked at the walls. The small wooden shelf where I kept my books and a few photographs. The curtain my mother had sewn from fabric she found at the market, blue with small white flowers. I had slept in this room my entire life. I was about to leave it, and I didn't know for how long. Maybe forever. That word sat in my chest like something swallowed wrong. My mother made breakfast even though none of us were hungry. She cooked my favorite, bun bo hu, the spicy noodle soup she had made for me every birthday since I was small. She put it in front of me and sat down across the table and looked at me while I ate and didn't say anything. That silence was one of the most loving things anyone has ever given me. Before we left for the airport, she pressed a thin gold bracelet into my hand. It had been hers, then her mother's before that. She said, "This is so you remember who you are, wherever you go." I put it on, and I have never taken it off since, not once, not in 8 years. The flight was 17 hours with a connection in Seoul. I had never flown before. The takeoff terrified me. That sudden, aggressive lift, the ground falling away beneath the window. Richard fell asleep before we even reached cruising altitude. I sat awake the entire flight, watching the darkness outside the window, eating almost nothing, holding my own hands in my lap. By the time we landed in Vancouver, it was morning local time, and I had been awake for more than 24 hours. And everything felt blurred and slightly unreal, like the beginning of a fever. It was January. I had never felt cold like that in my life. The air at the airport doors was like something physical, like walking into a wall. I had a coat. Richard had told me to buy one before we left, but it wasn't thick enough, and the cold went straight through it. Snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, and under any other circumstances, I think it would have been one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. Instead, I stood on the pavement outside Arrivals and watched it fall, and felt my eyes fill with tears that I refused to let become actual crying because Richard's older brother Kevin was already there with the car, and I did not want to begin this new life crying in front of a stranger. Kevin drove us to the house in silence. It was about 40 minutes outside the city, in a suburb called Langley. The house belonged to Richard's parents. That was the first time I understood we would be living with them, at least for a while. Richard had mentioned it, I think, but not in a way that made it feel real or concrete. Now it was very real. The house was large by my standards, but dark. Heavy curtains, dark wood furniture, carpet the color of old leaves. Richard's mother, Patricia, was waiting in the hallway when we came in. She looked at me for a moment before speaking, a long, assessing look, and then said, "You must be tired. Dinner is at 6. Richard will show you where things are." She did not offer to show me herself. She turned and went back to wherever she had come from, and I stood in the hallway of this dark Canadian house with my one suitcase and my gold bracelet, and tried to find something in myself that felt like hope. The next morning, Patricia came to the room where I was still half asleep from the time difference and told me she needed help in the kitchen. I followed her downstairs. She showed me where things were kept, but in the way of someone telling a new employee where the supplies are stored, not in the way of a mother welcoming her son's wife into a family home. She gave me a list before she left for her church group. The floors needed mopping, the bathrooms needed cleaning. Dinner should be started by 4:30 because Donald, Richard's father, liked to eat early. She said it all quickly and left, and I stood in the kitchen holding the list, reading it twice, and understanding that this was what my life here was going to look like. I did everything on the list. My back hurt by the afternoon, and my hands cracked from the cold water and the cleaning products, which were stronger than anything I'd used at home. Richard spent the day in the basement on his laptop. When I asked him after dinner whether I could call my mother, he said the international plan on their phone wasn't set up yet, that it would take a few days. I nodded and went to wash the dishes. I found a way to send my mother a short message through an app on my phone using the house Wi-Fi. I wrote, "I arrived safely. The house is cold, but it's okay. I miss you. Tell Lynn I miss her too." I stared at the screen for a long time after I sent it, waiting for her response. When it came, a string of heart emojis and "We miss you too. Be strong, my daughter." I went to the bathroom, turned on the tap so no one could hear me, and cried for a long time. That was how my life in Canada began. Not with cruelty exactly, not at first, nothing dramatic enough to point at and name. Just cold water and a list of chores and a husband who had become, the moment we boarded the plane home to his own country, a slightly different person than the one who had eaten dinner at my parents' table and brought good tea and smiled carefully for the wedding photographs. Not unkind, just absent. Already somewhere else, behind a screen, or next to his father, or simply unavailable, in a way I couldn't quite describe, but felt constantly. Patricia made clear quickly that she had expectations of me, and that those expectations were mostly about how much I could do and how quietly I could do it. She was not a shouting woman. That was Donald's style, a big man with a loud voice who went red in the face if dinner was late or if something wasn't done to his standard. Patricia expressed her dissatisfaction in a quieter way, through looks and silences and comments that sat just at the edge of what could be called an insult. One morning I made congee for breakfast, simple rice porridge, the way my mother made it, with ginger and green onion. And Patricia came into the kitchen, looked at the pot, said, "Richard doesn't eat that kind of thing," and poured herself coffee and left. I ate my congee alone at the kitchen table and told myself it didn't matter. There were days when I wanted to call my mother and tell her everything. Instead, I called her once a week. Richard had set up the international plan eventually and told her I was fine, that the house was comfortable, that Richard was kind, that the snow was beautiful. I did not tell her about the lists or the cold water or the way Donald looked at me when I spoke too slowly, because my English was still catching up to me. I did not tell her because I knew what she would do. She would worry, and she would feel guilty, and there was nothing she could do from 11,000 kilometers away except carry that guilt with her, and I loved her too much to give it to her. After 4 months in that house, I found out I was pregnant. I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the test in my hand for a very long time. My feelings were complicated in a way I'm not sure I can fully explain. There was real happiness in there, a warmth I hadn't felt since arriving, a sense of something new and mine beginning. But underneath the happiness was something close to fear. Because I was already exhausted, I was already struggling. And I could not quite imagine how adding a baby to this house, this dynamic, this particular version of my life, was going to make any of it better. I told Richard that evening. He nodded. He said that was good news. He told his parents at dinner. Patricia said, and cut her chicken. Donald said good and went back to his newspaper. That was the announcement of my pregnancy in the Collins household. No embrace, no warmth. No one asked me how I was feeling. I went to bed that night with my hand on my stomach and whispered to the small thing growing inside me that I was already on its side no matter what, that it was not alone, that I was going to figure this out. The pregnancy changed nothing in terms of what was expected of me. Patricia seemed to believe, genuinely, that working hard was good for a pregnant woman, that rest was a form of laziness. I cleaned and cooked and mopped through the first trimester, through the nausea that hit me every morning like a wave, through the dizziness that sometimes made me have to sit down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and wait for the room to stop tilting. Richard, when I told him I wasn't feeling well, said I should take a break after I finished what I was doing. Patricia said nothing at all, which was somehow worse. I held on. I had my mother's bracelet and the baby and a small, stubborn belief in myself that nobody had managed to take from me yet. And I promised myself, quietly, privately, the way you make promises that matter most, that I was going to find a way. I didn't know what way, I didn't know how, but I had come this far already, and I was going to keep going. My son was born in October, 7 months after I arrived in Canada. I named him Kai. Richard wanted something more Western, something that would sound right in a Canadian classroom, he said. We argued about it for the only time in our marriage where I actually held my position and didn't back down. I told him this was the one thing I was asking for, the one thing I needed, and eventually he let it go. Kai, it means ocean in some languages. I chose it because the ocean is the thing that separated me from everyone I loved, and I wanted my son to carry something that big inside his name, something that understood distance and still kept moving. The birth was long and painful, and I spent most of it holding the hand of a nurse named Sandra, who had kind eyes and who spoke to me slowly and clearly, and who, when it was finally over and Kai was placed on my chest, said quietly, "You did so well. He's beautiful." I cried when she said that, not because of the pain or the exhaustion, though both of those were real, but because it was the first genuinely warm thing anyone in this country had said to me in 7 months, and I hadn't realized until that moment how hungry I was for it. I brought Kai home to the house in Langley, and nothing changed except that now there was a baby in it. Patricia did not offer to hold him. She said the crying disturbed Donald's sleep, and that I should keep Kai in our room with the door closed at night. Richard went back to work after 10 days. I was alone in that house with a newborn, recovering from childbirth, still not fully fluent in English, still cracking my hands on cold water and cleaning products, now also waking every 2 hours through the night to feed a baby who cried with a ferocity that seemed impossible for something so small. There were nights in those early months that I do not fully know how I survived. I would sit in the rocking chair in our room at 2 in the morning with Kai against my chest, both of us awake, the house dark and silent around us, and I would feel a fear so complete it was almost like a physical thing, like being at the bottom of cold water. I was so tired. I was so far from home. I missed my mother with a sharpness that never dulled, not even slightly, not in the weeks or the months or eventually the years. I thought about her every single day. I still do. But then Kai would make a small sound or curl his fingers around one of mine, or look up at me with those dark eyes that were exactly the shape of my own, and something in me would harden into resolve. I had made him a promise before he was even born. I was going to keep it. One afternoon when Kai was about 3 months old, I put him in the second-hand stroller Richard's mother had given us. Given, not bought, sourced from a neighbor's garage with a slightly bent wheel. And I walked to the end of the street, and then further, just to be outside, just to breathe air that wasn't the interior of that house. A woman was walking her dog in the opposite direction, and she stopped when she saw us and looked into the stroller and said, "Oh, he's gorgeous. How old?" Her name was Helen. She had a warm, uncomplicated smile, and she talked to me for 20 minutes on that sidewalk in a way that required nothing from me except presence. She asked my name. She asked where I was from. When I told her Vietnam, she said she had always wanted to go, that she'd heard Hoi An was one of the most beautiful places on earth. I felt something loosen in my chest at that. Someone knowing the name of my town. Someone saying it like it mattered. Helen lived 4 streets away. We started meeting in the park near the end of her road 2 or 3 times a week, always in the afternoon when the weather allowed. She was in her 50s, her own children grown, and she had time and patience in equal measure. She spoke to me clearly and without condescension, and when I searched for a word, she waited for me to find it, rather than filling the gap herself, which sounds like a small thing, but meant everything to me at the time. Through Helen, I found out about a settlement services center in the nearby town that offered free English classes and support for immigrant women. She offered to watch Kai one afternoon a week so I could go. I told Richard I wanted to attend the classes. He shrugged and said it was up to me. Patricia said, "What do you need English classes for? You can already say everything you need to say." I went anyway. The center was a low building with bright walls and a bulletin board covered in flyers in 15 different languages. The English class had 8 women in it, from the Philippines, from Syria, from Mexico, from Ethiopia, from Guatemala. We were all at different levels and all, in some way, I recognized immediately, carrying versions of the same weight. Our teacher was a woman called Margaret, who had a loud laugh and absolutely no patience for the idea that any of us were anything less than capable. She pushed us hard and praised us genuinely and treated every small improvement as evidence of something already true about us, rather than something she was building from scratch. I loved those classes with an intensity that surprised me. Every new word felt like a door opening. Every sentence I managed to construct correctly felt like a small act of power, like something I was taking back. I practiced at home, quietly, whispering vocabulary to myself, while I mopped the floors, reading labels and signs and instruction manuals, and anything else with words on it. Kai was my most patient audience. I read to him in English and in Vietnamese, sometimes switching mid-sentence, and he watched my face with complete attention, which I chose to interpret as approval. After 4 months of classes, Margaret told me that a local grocery store near the center was looking for part-time help, just a few hours on weekday mornings. She thought I should apply. I told her my English still wasn't good enough. She told me my English was already better than I thought it was, and that the only way to find out was to try. I filled out the application form at the table in her classroom, with her sitting across from me, and she helped me with the parts I wasn't sure about. And I handed it in on a Tuesday afternoon, feeling like I had just done something either very brave or very foolish. They called me back. I had an interview with the store manager, a quietly efficient man named Paul, who asked me simple questions and listened to my answers without any of the impatience I had been bracing for. I got the job 3 mornings a week, 6 until 9:30, stocking shelves and helping at the checkout and sometimes tidying the produce section, which I grew to love because of how the vegetables smelled, cold and clean and alive, like something growing. Richard didn't object. I don't think he was paying close enough attention to our life to feel strongly about it either way. Patricia said, "What about the house?" I told her I would still do everything I always did, just later in the day. I said it calmly. I had been practicing calm the way I practiced vocabulary, deliberately, repeatedly, until it became something I could reach for reliably. I earned my first paycheck on a Friday in May, 16 months after I had arrived in Canada. It was not a large amount, but I sat in the parking lot of the grocery store and looked at the number on the paper and felt something move through me that I can only describe as the first breath. After a very long time of not quite being able to breathe, this was mine. I had made it. No one could take it from me or decide how it was spent. or use it as another reason I should be grateful for what I had. I opened a bank account the following week, in my own name, at a branch of a bank near the center. Helen came with me and helped me understand the forms. I deposited my paycheck, and then I sat in my car in the parking lot again and called my mother. I told her the truth for the first time since I'd left. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but more than I had told her in the entire previous year and a half. I told her I had been struggling, that it had been harder than I'd let on, that the house was cold in more ways than the weather. I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Maya, why didn't you tell me?" And I said because I didn't want her to worry, and there was nothing she could do from so far away. She said, "I could have prayed harder." And I started to cry, not the quiet, careful crying I had been doing for a year and a half, but the real kind, the kind that comes from a place that's been under pressure for too long. She talked to me for an hour. She told me about Lynn, about the town, about the river with the lanterns. She told me she ate bunbo hue every Sunday and thought of me when she did. She told me she was proud of me and that she knew I was strong because she knew where I came from and she knew what I was made of. And she told me something else, something she said quietly near the end of the call, something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "A good life is not given to you, Maya. You have to decide you deserve one, and then you have to build it. Nobody else will build it for you." I drove home with red eyes and my mother's voice still in my ears, and Kai asleep in his car seat in the back. And I thought about what she had said all the way home and for several days after. You have to decide you deserve one. I wasn't sure I had done that yet. Decided clearly and completely that I deserved better than what I had. I had been surviving, I had been enduring, but surviving and deciding are not the same thing. And my mother, 11,000 kilometers away, had just identified the exact difference. Something shifted in me after that call. Slowly, and then more quickly, the way rivers change speed when the ground changes beneath them. I started saving money with a purpose I hadn't had before. Not vaguely saving, not just holding on to whatever I could, but saving towards something specific. An apartment, a place that would be mine and Kai's, small probably, and nothing glamorous, but ours. With no lists on the counter in the morning, and no loud voice from the room next door, and no one looking at my son like he was an inconvenience. I started asking questions at the settlement center about what my rights were, legally, as an immigrant woman with a child. Margaret connected me with a legal aid clinic that ran free consultations on Thursdays. I went. The lawyer I spoke to was young and thorough, and she explained things to me patiently. She told me what I was entitled to. She told me what documentation I would need. She told me that my son was a Canadian citizen by birth, and that I, as his mother, had legal rights that could not simply be overridden by whoever spoke the loudest in a hallway. I remember leaving that clinic and walking to my car and sitting for a moment with my hands in my lap, feeling something settle into place inside me. Knowledge does that, real specific knowledge, the kind that tells you exactly where you stand and what you can do. It settles you in a way that nothing else quite manages. I was not trapped. I had choices. I had to build them carefully, and I had to be patient, and I had to keep showing up every day to the slow work of making them real. But they existed, and knowing they existed changed everything about how I carried myself in that dark house in Langley. Patricia noticed something had shifted in me, though I don't think she could have named exactly what. She came into the kitchen one evening while I was making dinner and watched me for a moment and said, "You seem different lately." I turned around and looked at her. "I'm different," I said. She didn't reply. She took her tea and left the kitchen, and I turned back to the stove and I allowed myself quietly to smile.